Welcome to Small Animals Matter with me, Dr. Miles. For this video, I've gone through a lot of research material and I've got a lot of interesting information to share with you. By the end of this video, the whole pasture-raised cattle, anti-vegan, carnivore diet, the only animals I harm are 2 cows a year thing will have been completely destroyed by research evidence which hasn't been discussed before on YouTube. Also, by the end of this video, you will have seen the world's smallest ambulance. So let's get going. Anti-vegans often point out that plant-based lifestyles cause harm to animals through the crop production process, whether that's through pesticide use or through combine harvesters or whatever else. However, those arguments ultimately work in favour of veganism because so many crops are grown to feed livestock that being vegan causes fewer crop harms than being non-vegan. Veganism leads to a major reduction in harm, not only in relation to farm animals, but also in relation to wild animals out in the fields. Plus, of course, vegans aren't paying to harm creatures out in the sea. Veganism is therefore objectively better in terms of ethics. It leads to a significant reduction in harm. But carnists have attempted to circumvent all this by saying either that vegans claim to cause zero harm, which isn't true, but carnists are trying to catch them in some sort of self-contradiction, or, and this is equally false, carnists say that livestock feed is just a byproduct of the biofuel industry, which again isn't true at all. Only about 8% of crops are used for biofuels, and in any case that livestock feed isn't a byproduct, it's a co-product. In other words, it's economically essential. So anyone who financially supports animal agriculture is responsible for that harm to wildlife. However, anti-vegans remain in complete denial about all of this, and they keep repeating the crop harms argument, the crop harms accusation, as if it's still a valid argument against veganism. And something unexpected has started to happen. They used to list the vertebrate animals who get harmed. So they talk about every vole, every snake, etc. But now they often refer to invertebrate animals as well when they're busy listing the creatures who are harmed through crop production. So they'll add in earthworms, and they very often now talk about insects, which they didn't used to do, but nowadays it's extremely common. Now obviously they don't actually care about any of the wild creatures who are being harmed through food production. If they did, then they would already have found out that non-vegans cause more crop harvesting and therefore more crop harms, and so they would already have become vegan. They're just pretending that they think that worms and other invertebrates, such as insects, have moral value. However, thanks to new research which was collated just a few months ago by the Royal Society, the scientific establishment is now finally accepting that insects are conscious beings, and by extension that they have moral worth. We know that insects dream, we now even know what insects dream about, we know that they have a wide range of emotions, and all these things I've gone through in my insects dream video, which I made a few weeks ago. So what started out almost as a joke on the part of anti-vegans, but insects matter as well, they were saying it in the same way that they say, but plant lives matter, has turned out to be absolutely correct. Carnists were accidentally right. So if they want to take invertebrates into account, and if the science supports that, which it does, then okay, let's test it out. Let's see if the evidence leads us to a carnivore diet or a normal omnivore diet or to veganism. Where does the evidence point? Well, the first thing we find is that if being a non-vegan causes more crop harvesting than being vegan, then in order to cause less damage to all those worms and insects, we need to be vegan. Obviously. Simple. But, and here's where it gets really interesting, where does that leave pasture-raised cattle, where there's no crop harvesting happening at all? I mean, pastures look very peaceful, so presumably anti-vegans are right when they claim that it's possible to harm just 2 creatures per year if all you eat is pasture-raised cattle. and in which case they presumably also be right when they say that they are harming fewer creatures than vegans. But let's look at the evidence. Purdue University is one of the top universities in the world for interdisciplinary science, and it has a department of agronomy, which is the study of crops and soil. And that department has produced a report entitled Earthworms and Crop Management. And this points out that some types of worm are often not present at all in cropland. So, by definition, they're not going to be there and be harmed. And the other types of worm are far less abundant in cropland than they are in pastureland. So in crop fields, the number of potential accidents is just much lower because there aren't as many individuals who could be harmed. Data collected in Indiana and Illinois over 10 years showed that the mid-range for ploughed fields is to have 75 worms per square metre, but in the mid-range for pasture is 820. 75 versus 820. So crop fields have less than 1/11 of the worms that are found in pasture. And that same pattern of fewer creatures in crop fields holds up in relation to all of the other little animals. Centipedes, bugs, and so on. For example, it was shown in the Journal of Arid Land, volume 11, that there are significantly fewer creatures per area of cropland than in pasture. Meanwhile, in a study published in the Journal of Animal Ecology entitled The Arthropod Population of Pasture Soil, arthropods include insects, but they don't include earthworms, so this is in addition to the worms. It was shown that in a pasture which they studied near Cambridge, England, there were 346,000 insects and other arthropods in just 1 square metre of soil. These comparisons show that the number of little creatures in cropland is relatively modest, meaning that there aren't as many creatures in the firing line. But these same comparisons also show that the number of little creatures in pastureland is very high. Now, in pastureland, the greatest number of creatures is found in the top 7.5 centimetres or 2.5 centimetres, depending on which study you look at, of the soil. Some of them live above the soil, of course, but many of them live in the soil, a huge proportion. And what's the significance of that? Well, cattle are incredibly heavy, with large hooves, hard hooves, and they walk around and they stand around, and when they're not doing that, they lie down, and all of this exerts crushing pressure down onto the soil and through the soil. And this has been extensively studied. The Journal of Soil and Tillage Research, volume 82, page 129, states that the depth of trampling-induced soil compaction varies depending on animal weight and soil moisture, and could range from 5 to 20 centimetres. Now obviously beef cattle are going to be towards the 20 centimetre end rather than, for example, sheep, who are less heavy. So most of the hundreds of thousands of little creatures per square metre of pasture soil are within the compaction range. And just to be clear, the issue of cattle crushing small creatures has been directly studied as well. It's not just a question of bringing together the research about the number in the soil and the compaction of the soil and collating them. It's also a question of directly experimenting with this and confirming it, which they've done. The journal Soil Biology and Biochemistry, volume 24, showed that when cattle trod on the experimental plots of land, they destroyed between 70% and 86% of the earthworms. Again, in the journal Applied Soil Ecology, volume 53, it states that grazing livestock affects the soil invertebrate community by impacting on the physical habitat through treading, and that the vulnerability of soil invertebrates to livestock treading was consistent in all 3 sites. So wherever they looked, they were finding the same pattern. Cattle were crushing the little creatures. And then they cite 5 further studies in which soil compaction from cattle was shown to have a negative effect on invertebrate creatures. But if these small animals in cropland are being crushed in their trillions and quadrillions, then why are the population sizes of invertebrates so high in pastureland? I mean, why haven't they all just been wiped out generations ago? Well, this of course is because of repopulation. They breed rapidly, and when the cattle crush pockets of ground with their hooves, the little creatures who haven't been trodden on are able to proliferate and then repopulate that area. And this is all helped by the manure which is constantly being added to the pasture land, and this has itself been studied extensively. A beef cattle steer produces around 75 pounds of manure per day, and this increases the populations of earthworms and of insects because they use this as a food source and they use it to do with procreation. So what you've got is a perfect system of creatures being encouraged to proliferate because they're in this perfect environment for increasing their numbers, and meanwhile they're being squashed and then they're breeding, and you've got these two forces going against each other: extreme proliferation and extreme harm. So the numbers clock up massively. Now wild animals such as deer are going to tread on little creatures as well sometimes, but the impact is far less because they're so much lighter than beef cattle. Plus, things like that are naturally occurring, and so it's arguably outside our sphere of responsibility. But getting these enormously heavy, genetically modified beef cattle to roam around all day in what is essentially an insect farm is about as harm-free as driving cars up and down sensitive pastures all day. And if we weren't breeding these cattle into existence in order to exploit them, then of course none of this would be happening. And if there are 346,000 insects and other arthropods per square metre in pastureland, then a conservative estimate would reach a figure of at least 1 million small creatures getting crushed every day just by one heavy-hoofed bovine. Except that the "I only harm 2 animals per year" carnivore dieters are responsible for more than twice that, because it takes more than 12 months for one steer cattle to reach what is called market weight. So it's not 2 animals per year they're harming, but more like 700 million per year. And let's remember that these are the same people who were the first to come forward and say that harm to invertebrates on farmland is a moral issue. And having stated this, they are now guilty of the kind of hypocrisy of which they are attempting to accuse vegans, because livestock are either being fed by harvested crops or they're on pasture land, and there is an endless number of little creatures being squashed flat by cattle. And just to be clear, a beef-based diet is no worse than any other non-vegan diet. They're all terrible in their own ways. The dairy industry is terrible, the egg industry is terrible. What happens to chickens in terms of their flesh and the breeding of chickens for meat is absolutely appalling, and it happens in huge numbers because they're smaller than cattle are. And then what happens with fish and with other marine creatures is just unbelievable. So none of these options is remotely ethical. But the point is that the ethical pretensions of pasture-raised beef carnivore dieters are completely ludicrous. I mean, they're claiming to cause an absolute minimum of harm, less than vegans, only 2 creatures per year, and yet it's in the hundreds of millions. And just to be clear again, the insects and other invertebrates on cropland are being harmed in very significant numbers as well. It's not just happening on pastureland, which is all the more reason, one, to go vegan, because that means that you're causing fewer crops to be grown and fewer crop harms. And it's also a reason to go towards veganic agriculture, where you remove exploitation and harm to animals completely. Now, anti-vegans can no longer claim that pastureland, which makes up the majority of agricultural land, is any better than cropland, especially once we take into account invertebrate animals. And I want to leave you with just one more brief fact. About 1 or 2% of US pastureland is organic, and on all the rest of it, farmers quite often and in varying amounts use the exact same pesticides which are used on cropland. And I'll just give you one quick source about that. I'll quote the full sources in the video description along with the other sources, but one of them from a pesticide company helpfully explains to us that upon ingestion of product, a caterpillar will take several days to D word. I don't know if you can say the word these days, especially if you're a smallish vegan channel. There are a lot of restrictions on what can be said, but I think you get the idea. They hang on for several days after they have ingested this horrendous poison. Pastureland is not idyllic, it's not minimising harm. There is nothing ethical about the carnivore diet whatsoever. Not to mention what happens to the cattle. But on a much lighter note, I thought I would end by showing you this. In a previous video, I showed you a glass and card which I used to rescue little creatures, and I know that quite a few of you who watch these videos did the same sort of thing, whether that's moving a snail off a path or whether it's rescuing a fly or a wasp who's become trapped behind a window. And I thought I'd show you this. It's not very practical in terms of rescuing creatures, but as a video prop I thought it's pretty good fun. So here it is, the world's smallest ambulance, complete with flashing blue light. Emergency search and rescue. So here it is, and I may use it in other videos in the future as well. But there we go, the world's smallest ambulance as promised. So thank you for watching the video. Please give it a like, please subscribe. All of these things help the channel and help the information to get out to more people. And in particular, please leave a comment. I'm sure that lots of you have come across these types of argument before to do with crop harms. So tell me what your experiences are and how you've approached this. I'll be interested to hear. And as well as being interested to hear, it would also help the channel to grow and to get this video to more people. So thank you again for watching, and remember, until next time, that small animals matter. Take care.